You know, back when I was in the academy, we would follow every toast with a song.
Hi everyone, this is Jay Record, bringing you another edition of Where No Bubs Has Gone Before, a Star Trek Next Generation podcast hosted by me and my father, Jake Record, where we explore the 7 seasons of Star Trek The Next Generation, discuss the impacts it had on our relationship, our views of the world, and so many other things. How are you doing today, Jake?
I'm good, Jay.
Well, this is going to be a really interesting episode.
I think so.
We are reviewing arguably the worst Star Trek episode ever. It's been called many, many things. I know you just finished Star Trek Enterprise.
Yes.
So you saw These Aren't the Voyages, which is the very last episode of Star Trek Enterprise.
Right.
That's actually considered the worst episode on many lists. So before we get started, since both you and I are very familiar with Enterprise and TNG, if you had to pick a worst episode, is it Code of Honor or is it These Are the Voyages?
I'd have to say Code of Honor because These Are the Voyages, the last episode, season 4 of Enterprise. You know, when you're winding down a series, you have to do it somehow. And, you know, there was hints in season 4, you know, particularly from Daniels, the person from the, what was it, the 29th century or wherever it was.
31st century. I think it's called the temporal, it's the, I guess the time agency? I forget.
Yeah, something like that. But there were hints that Archer had a very important role to play in the organization of the races in the galaxy that led to the Federation and so forth. So I thought it was okay. But this one, to get into Code of Honor, it's like, you know, how did this end up being so racist?
So there's an interesting story behind that.
Go ahead. Yes.
You know, so we're into the first season of Star Trek. This is technically for people watching at home, this is actually the 3rd episode. The first episode this is the 4th episode of the first season. We're watching on Netflix, everyone listening. So Encounter at Farpoint is actually 1 episode on Netflix, but technically it's 2 episodes. But, you know, with this being the 4th episode of the first season, they brought in a director. I'm making sure I get his name correct. They brought in a director named Russ Mayberry, and apparently partway through the filming, Russ Mayberry was replaced because he was having conflicts with the crew, and a lot of people were pointing out like this episode is starting to look really racist. One of the things that happened in Code of Honor is originally the Ligonians were supposed to be a reptilian race, and they were supposed to have full prosthesis, but because of budgetary concerns, they cut that. And for some reason, the producers and the showrunners decided to cast an alien race that is nothing but black people. So, you know, everyone just heard that line at home. This is going to be a little bit of a heavier episode just because we're going to be dealing with a lot of maybe some uncomfortable themes here. But overall, this episode was basically a disaster from the get-go, where they had to bring in the second director, Les Landau, in to finish it. You know, just to get started, I think this episode starts with a really interesting premise where on I think it's Steris 4.
Correct. Steers 4. Yeah.
There is an outbreak of Angeles fever on Steris 4, and only this vaccine that's available on the planet of Ligon 2 is applicable to actually solving the outbreak, which I actually find interesting because, a lot of these episodes that are coming out in 1987 are dealing with a lot of things that we're dealing with today in terms of pandemics, outbreaks.
Right.
I find it very interesting that, you could have an outbreak of a very serious disease on on a separate planet in the universe, and somehow, some way, on another planet, the cure's there for it. I think scientifically that's a very interesting idea because it might mean there's some ideas about the universe that kind of seg together. Like, there's this thing called the completion theory that with the formation of the universe, not everything can become a class M planet. Some of them are just unlivable. Not everything can become not everything can be a white giant star,
Sure.
The universe is not equal in its distribution of powers, resources. Same thing with Earth. There's some places where you can find tons of iron in the world. Like if you go to Finland and you go out to the bogs, you can dig out those bogs and get a lot of red iron dust. But if you go to I guess if you go to the middle of the Sahara, finding something like iron's very, very difficult. So, resource allocation naturally is not this very stable thing on our planet. So I find it very interesting that even in the future world where we've expanded among the universe, we're still dealing with the problem of resource allocation when it comes to dealing with really big emergencies. And again, I think this kind of fits into what's happening today in terms of everything with the rollout of the vaccine. And I think that this episode, if there's any good parts of this episode, and there are two or three, I think one of them is that at least the frame of the story is relevant to what's going on today, and was probably very relevant at the time too. But besides that, let's get into the really difficult stuff.
Sure.
So the crew arrives at Ligon 2, and they bring on board essentially the ruler of Ligon 2, Lutan, and I always get the other guys. I always forget the other. There's another actor there who plays the Hagon. That's it. He beams up with Hagon, and they deliver a sample of the vaccine to Picard. And one of the
Yes.
first things that happens is that Lutan is immediately struck by the beauty and the poise and the presence of Tasha Yar. He's amazed, as all the other Ligonian men are, that a woman is serving in a chief security position and that she's being kind of entrusted with these large amounts of responsibility. I think it's, like I said, this is going to be a difficult episode to talk about because on one hand, it's such a bad episode. It's like talking about mud. Like, where do you pick the pieces apart? But on the other hand, I think that the conversations we're having now about the portrayal of Black people in cinema, in television, in music, across the spectrum of popular entertainment today, which is an important conversation we need to have. In terms of depicting people with dignity and giving them a sense of agency and a sense of honor, and we'll get into this word honor a lot because I know you want to touch on that.
Yes.
It's hard to make the argument that Hollywood did not have a stereotypical bias or employed people that had racial or stereotypical biases, as we can see in this episode. I mean, this episode is a living example of how cast or portray Black characters on TV. At the same time, the entire premise is built around the idea that Lutan is basically going to kidnap Tasha Yar in something that's called, and there's a technical term for it that I found out, a counting coup.
Oh, yes, sure.
Which, there's a lot of things about the show that are just kind of incongruent, like this. So counting coups are actually heroic acts of everything from going into battle to kidnapping. But, while the show tries to present a 1940s Africa in terms of the Ligonian, the Ligonians, this actually is taken from Native American culture, counting coups. So
Yeah.
it's actually really interesting that it's interesting, and it's also interesting in a bad way that there's really no way, I think, to depict a character of a noble savage without being very, very careful about it. And I think obviously there's a big conversation, and we're going to get into the discussion about honor here in a second, because I think this is the crux of it. There's a very big conversation at play in this episode about honor and ceremony and ritual in terms of how it plays into the power structure of the Ligonian society. And it's all built on this kind of idea of noble savagery. Like, they're rough, they're kind of barbaric, they kidnap people, but they see themselves as having this dignity that is expressed in their culture and in their relationships. And it's kind of a throwback to a lot of 18th century stories about, like I said before, the noble savage. And on one hand, the noble savage character, I think, is always an interesting character to put out there, because I think here in civilization, because we are civilized, I think that we always want to look back to barbarians and kind of lionize them and mythologize them. I think I call it the Conan the Barbarian syndrome. We all want to be wild somewhere deep inside of us. We all want to be aggressive and powerful, and I think the noble savage depicts that. I think the problem here is that what the noble savage is depicting is not only dishonorable, it kind of takes all these bad things that are already kind of going on with the cast and the directing, and it kind of really muddies the water. So I wanted to get into this quote that I think is really kind of at the crux of it. I want to see this. A code of honor is like a magic cloak.
Is like what?
I think he says a code of honor, magic cloak. It's the big line in the show. Oh yeah. Oh, a code of honor. Lutan says right before Yar and Yamina fight.
Yes.
That timeout. A code of honor. A code of honor protects one captain like a magic cloak. I think that this is a very interesting look into how a noble savage is depicted here in the West, because on one hand, I was recently speaking about how sometimes noble savages kind of projected this wild, honorable hero. But in literature, there's also a form of the noble savage that is kind of conniving, and the term noble is used kind of as a satire on the character itself. So getting into that, I really wanted to look into what your topics were on the conversation of honor, if you wanted to get into that.
Well, sure. One comment I wanted to make is that, when you talked about the quote that honor is a cloak, I was wondering in terms of their social structure, which was related to their code of honor. what was it that Lutan actually needed or was looking for?
He wanted to kill his wife and get her lands,
Well,
and
that
also have Tasha Yar as a replacement.
which was a little bit of a racist thing of the black man being attracted to the white woman.
Oh yeah.
So that was there
Oh yeah.
because I thought he was either bored with his wife, or did he also know that she no longer loved him, so he needed her to fight for her position to be his first, and he actually was trying to use Tasha to kill Yarina.
Mm-hmm.
And Troy, at one point made the comment about Luton's extreme avarice and ambition. But then to get into the whole honor issue, one of the things I looked on Wikipedia, and I've got this up here, the dictionary word, the first definition of honor as a noun is high respect, semicolon, great esteem.
Mm-hmm.
The second one might be more appropriate here because that is adherence to what is right or to a conventional standard of conduct.
Ooh,
So,
yeah.
Conventional can be operationally defined relative to, the society you were in. I mean, I think that one of the things that might come up in other episodes is particularly in regard to studying Worf, because Klingon honor, that the sense of honor is very strong,
Yes.
but it's very different from human sense of honor versus Ferengi sense of honor, which is their honor is all based on the rules of acquisition versus what we're seeing in the Ligonians.
Yes.
So I think that honor can really be, culturally or societally defined. And Picard makes some comments about humanity growing out of honor issues.
Yeah, I thought that was actually a very interesting line, and that's one of the things I wanted to talk about. We're in the middle of this great transition after 4 years of the previous president, and this is the first the first few days into the Biden administration. And I think one of the big questions that we've dealt with about since 2016 and the rise of Trump was, there were a lot of these questions about defining America's honor in the world. Because if you really think about it, like Trump, all of the stuff he said about China, all the stuff he said about how we're treated by NATO, he always framed it in this idea that, we're being dishonored. And I think Picard's talking to something like that. And that's a really recent thing. But, culturally, I think honor is such a difficult thing to nail down. Because I was trying to think of like a big event where America had to go and defend its honor. And the easiest one that I could think of was like World War II, where we were attacked at Pearl Harbor. Like, you can't just, we live in a world where we were attacked at Pearl Harbor by the Japanese, and we couldn't just sit there and not do anything. Because, in some ways, guarding our honor was also guarding our geopolitical importance in the world.
Well, yeah, and see, that's the thing is, this episode has made me think about what does honor really mean, and how important is it? Because, there was a lot of prior geopolitics going back into the 19th century that led up to events that resulted in the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, and we had done things, geopolitically and economically to the Japanese that put them in a position so that they felt they had to sting us and, destroy our naval fleet in the Pacific. And they had the impression that our society was soft and that we would not fight. And so, I don't know how, when people talk about a sense of honor or when somebody in a movie, in a military situation says, oh, it was an honor serving with you, what does it really mean versus, since honor is a convention,
Mm-hmm.
and I kind of defaulted to what's the honorable thing to do? And does the real answer come back to do unto others?
Yeah,
I mean, that might be the ultimate honor, but that's even beyond honor.
true. Well, that's the thing about do unto others is that it's also a basis for compassion. Um, I think you bring up a really good point about previous Japanese history because the show itself used Japanese culture in terms of Bushido to actually build kind of the honor system that the Ligonians have. Again, the episode itself is a mishmash of like a bunch of different things taken from the world and
Mm-hmm.
then just jammed together. And one of them was this kind of idea of Bushido.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it- you know, I think that you have something there to talk about when it comes to the idea of honor being a convention versus quality, because I think that's what we're really talking about here. Is honor a quality within us as individuals, or is honor a positive connotation given to conventions within our society that we deal with every day? I'd like to think that there is a personal quality that we can have that's honor, but I also think that well, let me explain that a little bit. You have to make a decision every day whether or not you're going to tell lies or not. You have to make a decision every day if you're going to be a good human being. You have to make a decision whether or not you're going to get up and treat people fairly. And I think inherently, if you have a sense of honor to yourself, how you act and how you present yourself and how you treat others is built into defining that sense of honor. Like, speaking personally, I think I have a sense of honor, and I base that sense of honor in how well I treat others, how well I treat Margot, how well I treat Ben, how well I treat you and Mom. But that isn't where it started. Because growing up, I also had a sense of honor that was very macho and a little bit angry. So I think honor has a very difficult I think honor is a very difficult quality or virtue to nail down for the individual. But speaking on it as on the conventional level, on the operational level, as you've noted, um, you know, there's so much that you could point to when it comes to honor that we've built into our general society now here in the present. You know, and I hate to pick on them, but they're there to pick on. Um, the GOP keeps talking about.
Well, I
Sorry.
was just thinking the same thing because it comes, what you're saying when you're using the term, it's operational.
Yes.
It comes down to behavior or how one behaves or how a group behaves. And as you were talking, you talked about, you mentioned GOP. I was thinking moving towards some thoughts toward um, the behavior of political parties now.
Hmm. Well, political parties are a very interesting thing here now because there is this, and we can kind of frame it in terms of the episode. What is honor for Starfleet versus honor for the Ligonians? Because it seems like for the Ligonians, honor is this individualistic, kind of selfish pursuit for power or the assumption of power. Because Lutan's entire goal is, not only to kill his first one, Yamina, but also demonstrate honor by capturing Tasha Yar and making her his first one, while at the same time taking over his former first one's lands and property. By the definition of his society, Lutan has done something honorable, or he's acting in an honorable way. The reason why we don't think he's acting in an honorable way is because we have Jean-Luc Picard and the rest of the crew there to provide a contrasting point. where I think honor in Starfleet or in the Federation ethics is probably built around the idea of maintaining one's dignity and maintaining the dignity of others. You know, there's arguably an honor rescue happening with the crew where they have to go save Tasha Yar's honor because she's been kidnapped. In a way, they have to save their own honor because they've lost a crew member.
Well, there was another aspect we might talk about later is the prime directive comes up
Yes.
because Picard says at one point, with the power of our ship, we could take what we want.
Mm-hmm.
But he does not do that
Exactly.
because that wouldn't be honorable. I don't know how it would, where the prime directive really comes to play here because, this was not a first contact with the Lugonians. But again, I think the thing that counterbalanced the opportunity that the Starfleet, the Enterprise crew just could have gone onto the planet and however they wanted to do it, even if they had to shoot some people or stun them, they could have, taken the vaccine that they needed, but they chose to use diplomacy and respect the folk ways and mores of the Ligonians.
Well, I think that gets back into the
here's another thing. This is another thing that comes into honor where
absolutely.
it wasn't talked about, but Tasha wants to fight Urena and Picard wants none of it. But Troy, who, was very active in this episode because she was a very active advisor to Picard and it was openly displayed, even in front of the Ligonians. Tasha made a moral decision or gave it moral advice that supported Tasha's sense of honor in fighting Urena, saying that, Captain, Tasha needs to do that because that's what we need to do to secure the vaccine. She said, we are all at, and then I think it was actually Tasha that said, we are all at risk every day of every mission.
Yes. I think that there is a very good example of what I was talking about earlier, of personal honor.
Yes.
And maybe in Starfleet, and maybe we can wax on this idea a little bit. In the future, what kind of morals and ethics does Starfleet engender within its own people? Because I feel like here in America, when it comes to our military, the first thing that we put forth is the defense of the nation. Like, our military is there to defend the nation. Starfleet isn't there to necessarily defend Starfleet. It's there to maintain some sort of order in the Alpha Quadrant. But maintaining order doesn't always have to be built around defending one's position or attacking. Maybe in the 23rd or 24th century when this is taking place, maybe they've done away with the idea of like honor combat, honor duels on Earth, or wars of honor, but maybe they've redefined honor to fit into the idea of like, it's more honorable to talk with someone instead of forcing them into a physical conflict. It's more honorable to be diplomatic than it is to be aggressive.
Oh, I think that's a good point because it goes back to Encounter at Farpoint. Is the argument that Picard makes with Q that humanity has advanced in just that way.
Absolutely. So let's step off for a second into something. Let's step off into something we can make fun of a little bit. So they get to. Let me bring up my note real quick because. So they finally get to this fight between Tasha and Urena.
Right.
Oh, sorry, Urena. I've been saying Yamina for some reason. So, I'm a big fan of fight scenes in movies, books, television, stuff like that. This easily has to be the dumbest fight I have ever seen. Like, the absolute dumbest. I kept waiting for Tasha to just punch her in the knee. Like, it, it was such a silly scene from the get-go, from them swinging around these poles and swinging these weird mailed fists to each other, to Urena throwing off her weapon and it getting caught in one of the audience members' chests and him dying immediately.
Right.
It's so bad it's almost silly, and you can forgive it for that because it's funny at some point. But I just have to say, one of the worst fights I've ever seen in Star Trek, and maybe one of the worst fights I've ever seen on television. Like, it just did not look good.
No, I have to agree. I didn't think, I was not impressed with the whole mechanism of, where the fight took place.
So I think one of the big problems with the episode is that they never really go out of their way to explain anything. Like, where did the Ligonians get? I feel like every time the crew goes to a different planet, we always learn a little bit of history about the planet, or there's always a little bit of backstory built in, so we can kind of get where these people come from and how they think and feel about things. I'm trying to think of another episode that's going to be kind of different to talk about. Angel One. Do you remember that episode?
No.
It's where they go to the planet Angel One, where it's ruled by a matriarchal society where all the women are in charge and all the men
Oh,
are.
yes. Right.
So, um, the thing about Angel One, and I actually watched it today with Ben. The difference between how they depict the society in Angel One, which has a lot of problems on its own, versus how they depict the Ligonians, is that they take time in the episode Angel One to actually talk about like how this matriarchal society came to be, why its laws were created the way it was. There were civil wars, there was just a downfall in society, and this constitutional oligarchy they come up with in Angel One is a thing that solves their problems and sets them on the current course they're on. We have no indication who the Ligonians really are or how we get here.
Well, you made a previous point that you kind of compared this, the Ligonians were like depiction of, Black Africans in 1940s films. It made me think of the old Tarzan movies, which were extremely racist in their depiction of, Africans at that time. And, again, this was, there was no indication. The Ligonians, it was not first contact. The Federation knew about this Ligon 2 and so forth. They knew that that they had the vaccine. So, how did Ligon 2 in that race, fit into the scheme of, the politics and the economics and the trade rules of the Federation?
Yeah.
It just didn't make a lot of sense there. Where do these people show up in this way?
Yeah. Well, one thing that I'm always curious about the societies that the crew run into in Next Generation are, the Prime Directive says that you can't really interact with the society unless they're warp capable.
Right.
And there's no indication that the Ligonians actually have ships or that they have warp drive.
I had that thought too. Exactly.
And you keep hitting on something like I think we both kept coming back to, like, why are we here talking to these people? Like, there's just no real world building given to, I guess, dignify the reason why we're dealing with the Ligonians besides their vaccine.
Do you think that we'll see as we go through season 1 into other seasons that if there's been consistency um, among the writers of the show, that they will, they will figure things out more? Because again, this is the first season. They're sort of trying things out. I mean, again, we see Data is their reference to the human equation. And here, we're seeing the first time, actually, one of many times when Data is trying to understand humor, what that really means. So just like they're trying to figure out Data, how to present him, and I think we talked before that Brent Spiner is trying to figure out how to portray Data.
Mm-hmm.
Are we going to see an evolution so that they sort of maybe not even consciously define what the ways of Starfleet is, what honor is, how are these people going to consistently behave and think? How do they consistently apply the prime directive? And then also just in regard to the story writing, that they set up the situation of each episode where they're going to a different world so that the audience has enough background of obviousness to understand it.
Great questions. Um, you know, my opinion, and also a general opinion among fandom of Next Generation, is that the show's finally kind of coalesced into something really good around season 3. And that the reason that happens is because by that time, Gene Roddenberry's health is declining, and he is sharing producer. Roddenberry is sharing producer responsibilities with Maurice Hurley. One of the people that is also brought on as a co-executive producer is Rick Berman, and Rick Berman is responsible for season 3 of Next Generation onwards. He's responsible for Deep Space Nine. He's responsible for Voyager, and he's responsible for Enterprise. So what fans call quote unquote old Trek, he's responsible for 4 of the major shows. So yes, I think it gets better. To your second question, I think, and I think you can see this in the structure of the first season, especially this episode. I think third season onward, and there's going to be a couple episodes in these first 2 seasons. There's more character episodes after the beginning of season 3, where they focus on individual characters, not just the entire crew.
Right.
Because, okay, Encounter at Farpoint is basically focused on Picard and Q. But when they're dealing with everything that's happening, God, I already forgotten the planet's name that they went down. But when they're dealing with everything with the space jellyfish, like that entire storyline's about introducing the entire crew. The second episode is also not very... The Naked Now is about the entire crew. This episode kind of focuses on Yar and kind of focuses on Picard. But it feels like in the first season, there's a lot of episodes where everyone has a role in some way, but there's no real specific focus on one individual character. I think that really does start to change in season 3.
Well, and that's an interesting comment, because you being a writer, and you know how you have to, and you've done this, you've created an imaginary world and you've populated it with characters. And it just seemed to me that what's happening here in any story process, you have to take some time to paint the picture and describe the world in which the characters live. And until that happens, and you figure out how the rules are different, how society is different, how people, what their gender roles are, whether they're different and so forth. And here you're dealing with different species, different alien races. It makes sense that you wouldn't get into character episodes until you really get the crew, the ship coalesced into one entity.
Yes. Yeah, I agree with that. I think so. Touching on world building, and I never want to make this show about my writing, but
Right.
um, I my approach to world building, and I write novels and novellas and short stories, so it's very different from writing for TV. TV, you
Yes.
have a lot of constraints that a lot of people don't take into account. Like, for example, in a typical screenplay, one
Mhm.
page of a screenplay is supposed to represent 1 minute. So if you're writing a screenplay and you have to write 45 minutes of um, story for Star Trek every episode, or 43, it's usually 43 to 45 minutes every episode because we don't have to deal with commercial breaks thanks to Netflix. But that's 43 to 45 pages where
Mhm.
you don't necessarily have a lot of time for dialogue. You don't have a lot of time for exploring characters in a really deep way. So I think the way you get around that is by following the characters, but as they do things, build the world around them. And I think one of the problems with this episode is that there really isn't any world built around the crew as they're going through the travails on Ligon 2. It's a very slapdash story, Code of Honor.
Mhm.
There's not a lot of good. Okay, for example, putting on my writer hat for a second, they go from the cargo bay where Lutan gives Captain Picard the vaccine to Yar taking Lutan and Hagen to the holodeck,
Mhm.
where she demonstrates the holodeck's abilities by bringing up an Aikido ninja and demonstrating her Aikido, which Lutan falls madly in love with after she throws Hagen on his ass.
Mhm.
Um, I understand that scene in the holodeck in terms of building the character Lutan's motivation to kidnap Yar. He's seeing this powerful woman that he's immediately enraptured with, and she did the sexiest thing possible by beating down the crony that he always loves to beat down.
Mhm.
As a scene by itself, it makes sense. But if you look at like the transition of it, it doesn't really make sense in terms of the entire overall impact of the show. On one hand, like Hagen's not going to be fighting. Yar is not going to use any of her Aikido skills, so there's really no reason to keep showing off her Aikido through
Mhm.
the episode. Um, there's just a lot of there's not many good transitions in this episode. It seems like in some ways they just like from the cargo bay to the holodeck to Yar being kidnapped. There's they really don't have a narrative thread that ties them all together in a good way,
Mhm.
and I think that's a problem throughout the episode, where the only real time that they build a narrative thread is when Picard and Lutan finally start talking about Lutan's plans.
Mhm.
But that's it. Like, there's really nothing more to the show beyond that scene right there.
Now there was one other note I wrote that goes back to honor and fits in with the show is that when Yar wounds Urena and
Oh yeah.
she goes down because of the alkaloid poison, and they have a plan where they transport them both to the sick bay and Enterprise, where Dr. Crusher can, you know, obtain data to certify that Urena died, but then she can administer an antidote and revive her, so that the um,
Can I
you know
can I stop you there and ask you a question? A
yeah.
scientific question? Do you think that she really like in reviving her, do you think that she cures her with the antidote first and then revives her? Like in the future, how does that work?
I don't know. I just don't know enough about toxicology in terms of if this alkaloid poison had an action that quick and killed Urena. I don't know how if you administered an antidote, how quickly it would inactivate the poison, the effect of the toxin, and then how you would, restore somebody, back to life. But
I asked because I have a note here about that exact scene
right,
where I think my note is Urina's scene on the transporter pad with Crusher. What the fuck? Um, that's my note because you know I always I sat there and I was like, well, do you resuscitate her first if she's dead, or do you administer an antidote? Can you resuscitate someone who's gone through toxic organ failure?
I
How
mean,
does that all work?
you'd have to research a little bit because remember there was something in the original series where I think Kirk died and then Bones brought him back. And I can't remember the specifics, but it was another similar situation where there was an honor issue where,
Oh,
someone had
right.
to die in this fight. And then, so the point I was getting to is that Picard actually used the rules of honor relative to this contest against Luton because by restoring Urena, then the marriage was annulled, and he lost rights to her land, which she owned, which was one of the peculiar things about this planet is that it was patriarchally ruled, but in terms of wealth, it was
Matriarchally sanctioned.
yes.
Yeah.
So then, all of a sudden, the other guy, what was his name, Haran or whatever,
Hagen.
he becomes the male chief, and Luton has to step back and take his former uh, male retainer's role.
Yeah. I think on one hand, I think like the construction of Ligonian society is kind of interesting because, the idea of women ruling is not necessarily new to Star Trek. I mean, that's the Orions. Orion culture is built on
Oh
the
yes, right,
idea that, these sexy women that are depicted as kind of these sex slaves to be
right,
sold
right,
are actually in charge of all the men that are quote
yes,
unquote in charge of them.
right.
I think the difference is that there's a sense of duplicity and there's a sense of sneakiness and a sense of cleverness when the Orions do it. Where, again, we don't have enough world information about the world to really know how we got here with this and what it really means when we say Urena owns all these lands, but her first one rules them. Like,
And
how did we
and
get there?
and you had mentioned before when it gets to Angel One, where they go to a planet that is matriarchally ruled.
Mm-hmm.
It's something. We talked about this. Previously in terms of in 1987, 88, when Next Generation, the season one came out. You were in the midst of examination globally, whether you're in a Western culture or a Islamic culture, is what is the relationship between the working relationship between males and females? And, it's something that, it's something that is ongoing now. I mean, it was 1920 was when the amendment to the Constitution passed that women were able to vote.
Mm-hmm.
And then it was Franklin Roosevelt who appointed the first woman to a cabinet position. And then we had, Geraldine Ferraro back in 84 was a vice presidential candidate. And it was during Reagan's term that he appointed the first woman to the Supreme Court.
Mm-hmm.
Now we've got what, three women on the Supreme Court, I believe. And now we have the first vice president that's female, and plus she's mixed race.
And Indian.
Right.
Um, you know, I I think dealing with this episode from that viewpoint, I think in 2021, it looks really bad from this perspective. Well, let's just get it out of the way and say what makes the show really bad. If they had cast this show, and one of the Star Trek writers who I actually know, Keith DeCandido, he's a writer that wrote something for Falstaff Books, the publisher I'm with. He wrote actually a bunch of Star Trek novelizations that are really good. You know, he made the point that if you had cast these with, you know, if you had just thrown white people in the Ligonian cast or Indian people or all sorts of people, if you had really diversified the Ligonians and had them deliver the exact same lines and even put them in the same clothes, I don't think that we would be having this conversation about race right now.
Correct.
At the same time, I think if, you know, you mentioned all those wonderful women in our nation's past who were able to finally assume seats of power after such a long time of being denied the opportunity to take part and add to society in the most meaningful way. You know, when you go to government, you're really doing something important that I don't think a lot of people really take into account anymore. Um, I think when it comes to the Ligonians, we just don't know there's really no way to say what they're trying to do here in terms of depicting a matriarchal society because again, we don't know enough. Um, can you restate your question again real quick? I kind of deetered off there for a second. It's late, folks. Sorry about this.
Oh, I just think it does bring it's it's part of the again putting it into context of the time in 1987 that the examination of the relationship in society, government, between women and men was starting to be intensely examined, and changes were starting to occur. So you can put the kind of mixed up male versus female roles in Ligonian society, that it was, it kind of, you can look at it and say, well, again, we don't have any background as to how their society evolved to this point, why they had these gender relationships the way they were. But maybe it perhaps reflects in 1987 that examination was speeding up within
Yeah.
American culture at that time.
And maybe because it's so raw of a discussion still in 87, maybe that's one of the reasons why the depiction here is so fraught with issues in terms of how we see them in 2021.
Right.
Um, you know, one thing that I wanted to kind of touch on here is um, the another silly scene when they have to determine how Yar is supposed to use these weapons that she's going to fight Urena with. There is a very interesting scene where, you know, after examining him, Geordi and Data come to Picard and Yar and Troy and say, like, these are razor sharp, they're very light, they're poisonous. They were designed for women.
Yes.
Um, I find that interesting because it means that even though we don't get a lot of world building with the Ligonians, you never actually see men in combat in Ligonian culture. Like, besides, God, I keep forgetting his name. Horgan.
Mm-hmm.
Hagon. God, Hagon.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the only male Ligonian you actually see get into any sort of real physical altercation is Hagen when he spars with Yar in the holodeck.
Mm-hmm.
But if you go down to the planet, it's been made very clear that like the society is built on the idea of women fighting each other
Mm-hmm.
to determine land rights, power structures. It's a very again, it goes back to that kind of notion of the noble savages where we're going to define our honor by who's best in combat. but again, like you said, there's this kind of examination going on where, men kind of have this passive role, it seems, in society, where they somehow rule things, but it's the women who ultimately make these decisions, and they make them in kind of these, I would argue, brutal and masculine ways. I find it very interesting that in 1987 there is this kind of, I want to phrase this right because again, this episode's fraught. It seems to me in 87, and there's a couple places in Star Trek where they're going to do this in the first couple seasons. There's a lot of discussion about really trying to show that people in the future really see women as powerful and as capable and able. Even Worf, multiple times in the first season, will state very quickly that like Klingons respect strong women. And he's not the only character to say things like that. Riker says that a lot. Picard says that a lot. There's a lot of lines being given to this idea that women have an equal role to men. It's interesting to see them kind of constantly go back and forth on this idea that women are strong and powerful and able, and then depict this society where women are in charge, but they're still somewhat subservient, I guess, to the men, to the Lagonians. Again, like, we just don't have enough here to really flesh out like who these people are and what the purpose of this episode is.
Well, the other thought I had is interesting is that looking at the genre of science fiction and Star Trek, all of the different venues and, series that came out are, of course, in the future, which fits in very much with the science fiction genre. That gives you an opportunity, gives the reader, the writer and the reader, the audience, the opportunity to look into the future and say, well, how might we change? Where should we go?
Mm-hmm.
Particularly based on where we are now. I mean, you could do that with a sort of a non-science fiction book. I mean, I'm thinking about like just a novel like 1984.
Oh, yeah.
That really wasn't science fiction per se, but it was about the future. I mean, I've read recently some books about, time travel where modern people fell into some sort of time well and went back 40,000 years, and they imagined how they would survive and how they would interact, with the humans of that time, which is, a way to look back as to how those hunter-gatherer cultures were.
Mm-hmm.
And the one author that I read, most of the people were peaceful, but there were some groups that were very hostile
Mm-hmm.
and didn't want to collaborate with others. They just wanted to take materials and food and so forth from others, so that you could look at how things were and say, well, where were the roots of current society's behavior going back 40,000 years? And there were even some parts of the stories where somebody did something different, and they were able to come back into the present time, and they noted how what they did 40,000 years in the past changed society in the new present.
Mm-hmm.
So, it's just an interesting, I'm just thinking about, since I talked about how back in high school, I kind of had this fascination with science and science fiction. My Ray Bradbury senior year of high school term paper is, science fiction seems to be a really good way to examine these societal things now,
when
and
done great.
and how might things evolve in the future,
Mm-hmm.
and how might they evolve better, which, depending on where you are politically, one individual, say right now, who's very left wing, could have a very different view of how the future should be versus somebody who's very right wing. I mean, that's obvious, particularly in this day and time.
So I'm part of a Facebook group that I share a lot of memes and posts from called Star Trek shit posting.
I've seen those, yeah.
So a shit post is where you post something making fun of something or
Right.
pointing out the irony of something. Um, one thing that's happening in that group right now is that we're having a really big conversation about um, how we have discussions when it involves issues about race and LGBTQ issues, because these are things that happen in Star Trek a lot
Yes.
and have to be addressed, especially now with Discovery, where they've started to introduce gender fluid and non-binary characters. And there's
Mm-hmm.
a real split going on between conservative Star Trek fans and more moderate to liberal Star Trek to leftist Star Trek fans, where it seems like the conservative Star Trek fans think that adding diversity and adding different characters of different backgrounds is somehow muddying the vision of Roddenberry, or it's somehow turning these stories into panderings instead of actual explorations.
Mm.
But then, on our side, and I'm on the left side of this, I think if you really believe in the show, you have to believe in the ideas of equality and egalitarianism, and you have to believe in the idea of individual human rights and human dignity, not only on that individual level, but on a communal and societal level as well. I think Star Trek proposes that there is room in the universe for all of us, and that if we work together, we can have a better universe than not. I think a lot of conservative Star Trek fans at Star Trek shitposting, um, I think that they have a really hard time with that. I think part of it comes with their perceptions of the show. Um, the show, you know, but before Discovery and before Picard and before Lower Decks, the show very rarely touched on LGBTQ issues. It rarely it touched a lot on race issues and issues of gender, but when it came to um, dealing with lesbianism or homosexuality or transgenderism, um, those episodes are very few and far between. And I think now people are seeing that we have a lot of people in our society who are trans. We have to treat them like they're part of our society because they are. We have a lot of people that are gay, and we have a lot of people that are
I,
lesbian.
I heard today on the news that there's one cabinet member, I don't remember who or what department it was, who's trans.
Yeah. Oh, she's. I think. Well, I want to.
But
I'm looking her up. Sorry.
as you're researching that, I mean, it fits in with what I think what I said before, that in 1987, the evolution of gender roles in society, in politics, and governance were being examined because things were, actively changing. And now what you said about,
Dr. Rachel Levine. That's the.
yeah,
She was recently appointed to. She's the Assistant Secretary of Health,
right.
which is a
So,
big deal.
right. So when you mention, below decks and Picard and Discovery and so forth, it's true. They're truly, 21st century versions of Star Trek that are really discussing, um, social issues, the social issues of today.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the real utility of the show gets back to Roddenberry's vision that you want to be able to look out into the universe and hope that it's going to be a better place than you expect it to be. That, there is going to be this world where we kind of put aside our petty differences of honor, of race, of gender. we put aside those petty differences and we find our common unities, and we use that to empower ourselves to go out and explore the galaxy.
And that's an interesting point, because I mean that's a really interesting point, because if someone is, and this gets into comment you made about, sort of a difference of opinion with the newer current versions of Star Trek that are streaming right now, that some conservative groups are having problems with it, is if you're conservative and you tend to not want things to change, or you want to slow the pace of change, do people that are ultra conservative really want to see that change in evolution, which gets into the psychology of conservatism, particularly ultra conservatism. If they see themselves in a protected power position, socially, economically, and so forth, is part of the issue with them, or the discussion with them, is I just don't want to give my position up. I don't want to give anything up of my power, of my economic position, to anyone else.
I think a large part of it is that. I think there is a certain level of, it gets into the question of taxation. Why do I have to put forth when I'm not getting anything back? That's that's basically the conservative argument against taxes. Why are you taking my money when I don't see any real benefit from you taking my money? When we know intellectually that's just not true. Intellectually speaking, that money that we take in taxation goes towards really important services, towards, especially now in terms of maintaining people's stability and well-being during a
Mhm.
pandemic. Um, I think
A
you,
good
you catch me
example
at
of that.
you catch me at an interesting time with this question, because after everything that happened on January 6th and everything that's happened with QAnon and Trump going away, I've suddenly become very hypercritical of conservatives again, because there is a, and maybe Star Trek is part, Star Trek asks this question too. What decisions are we going to make to have a functioning society? And you I think Star Trek makes the argument that you can't have a functioning society built on discrimination, or the idea that some people are better than others, that everyone has inherent value. I think
I mean, yeah. I mean, one of the things that I think there's a tendency. You mentioned taxation. Some parents, some people, and they might mostly conservative, I would guess, but there might be middle, moderate, or even liberal people who decide public schools aren't going to be able to do a good job educating my child, so I'm going to send them to a private school.
yeah.
So if I'm going to pay taxes, you know, I either don't want my taxes to go to the public schools that suck, or I want some of my tax money for education to go to the private schools.
Yeah.
And that's perhaps a valid argument, but in terms of just social responsibility and the idea of having a functioning society, you know, economically, the vast majority of parents cannot pay for children to go to private schools, charter schools, whatever. So, if your children are all grown up and you're still paying taxes and so forth, if you're paying to send your children to private school, there's still a very important social responsibility to contribute to the revenue flow of the government to support public education.
Well, you
Because,
want a
because if you don't, again, it's going to contribute to dysfunction in society.
I that's exactly where I was going. Um, you want a strong, effective, powerful public education system that prepares the next generation for the challenges that they will face personally and publicly, in the future. You want people to be educated, so we can all, when a real crisis happens, you want people in the room that are at least knowledgeable, who can learn, who can take on new skills. And the only way you do that is by providing them with the basis of doing that through a solid education. But for that to happen, everyone has to be educated. It can't just be certain people. It can't just be the rich kids. It can't just be the people at the private schools. The argument that I don't want my money going to these shitty public schools is a bad argument, because the more shitty public schools we have, the more shitty people we turn out of them. If you have a bad school, you're not going to produce the best students. If you have a great school, you're probably going to produce great students. And those
The
great
the
students are going to go on and be great members of society or great citizens. But if you don't give them that foundation early on, and like you said, a lot of people can't afford it. You need to.
the the I'm just going to say the preamble to the U.S. Constitution, which is timely to review. We, the people of
Yeah.
the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish
Yes.
justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, and here's the key: promote the general welfare.
Yes. If you want a strong functioning society, you should want everyone educated, no matter if they're rich or poor, young or old, top to bottom. You should want everyone educated. And it seems in the future, everyone in the Federation has a very good education. Kind of
Yes.
skipping ahead to another episode that I just watched. Oh God, let me. It's here. It's not The Last Outpost. Okay. Here we are. Da, 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 da. Not down. Oh, When the Bow Breaks. Okay, so that, jumping ahead, and we'll definitely review this episode. When the Bow Breaks is when they go to that planet that's been hidden for thousands of years because they have a cloaking technology that they're
Yeah.
able to close the entire planet, and they kidnap the children off the Enterprise because they can no longer repopulate their own population. So they're,
Oh, right.
you know, there's an, one of the things that gets discussed there is that there's a scene where one of the children that gets kidnapped, is running through the hall, and he bumps into Commander Riker. Not Riker, being bigger than the child, knocks the child down, but helps him up. And his father catches up to him, and it turns out that this child has run away from his classroom because he doesn't want to learn calculus. This child's
Mhm.
like 7.
Right.
So, like, in the future, in the 23rd century, 7-year-olds are learning calculus. And
Well, I can tell you right now from just seeing what kind of math Will Martin, one of your nephews and one of my grandsons is learning, in what's he, sixth grade, seventh grade, the math he's learning is more advanced than when I was at a similar grade level in the 1960s.
oh yeah, me too. Um, well, it's funny that we bring that up because it goes into actual education research. What we found out now about, like, children and how they learn is that it's probably better to start teaching them these highly technical skills in math and science when they're really, really young. Like, really
Hmm.
start in preschool teaching them math and science and get them to things like calculus and the higher maths before they get to high school. And in high school,
Hmm.
you start teaching them the social sciences, and you start teaching them English and philosophy, because they'll already have all of this background, technical, um, operative knowledge, but now they need to be able to have the abstract knowledge. And
Mhm.
children. The argument is that children can understand the abstract, but it really takes an adult understanding and adult maturity to see the world for what it is. And
Mhm.
there's research showing that, like, children are able to pick up these higher maths and languages and all sorts of things really young. But we have the society now where we really don't start teaching those things until much later on in the educational journey of these children.
Mhm.
Like, Margaret, my wife, everyone, she took calculus, I think, junior year.
Hmm.
So junior year of high school. So Will, my nephew, he might be done with calculus by the time he's a freshman in high school. And that's a really big piece of progress that I think everyone should, everyone at home and everyone in general should really be celebrating, that we're getting our children up to this higher level of education.
And the other thought I've had about this is that compared to, when I was in high school and college, just what we know scientifically about, biological sciences, genetics, what we know about biochemistry, what we know about physics is so much more. It's like, how are you gonna teach young people all this information, this larger volume of information compared to 50 years ago or 100 years ago?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think one of the big things that plays into this, and it plays into the future of Star Trek too, is technology. They have in the future, it seems, in Star Trek, they have learning systems that are sometimes displayed on the show that are much more childlike in terms of their construction. Like, they seem like kid games. Like, there was this recent episode that I was again watching today, Coming of Age, when Wesley goes to take the Starfleet entrance exam. There is a test they're taking where they basically have to fill in the colors of a cube.
Mm-hmm.
And the only way you can do that is by getting the right coordinates and producing the right math in this test. But if you look at it, it's a child's game. It's like, God, I can't, it's late, folks. What's that cube? Rubik's Cube. It's like a Rubik's Cube.
Well, it makes me think of...
But it's important to note that when Wesley's doing that as a Starfleet, a potential Starfleet applicant at the Academy, he's playing this game with adults in the room. Like, he's the only 16-year-old.
It's like in the film The Voyage Home, and Spock's Contra has been restored to him.
Right.
And he goes into the machine and says, continue testing.
Mm-hmm.
And he, either had to relearn everything, or he's been able to pull it back up from his resurrected body. And there's also a scene in the Star Trek movie of 2009 where it shows the young Spock in Vulcan school, and then
Right.
the pits that just are throwing information at them and testing them and so on.
Constantly.
Yes.
So let's jump back to the show for a bit real quick, and Code of Honor, just to wrap this up, and then we'll get back to some other things. At the end of the episode, where they basically end up is that they resurrect Urena, they rescue Yar, and Lutan is made into the second one after Hagon takes over his position as Urena's first one. And Hagan gives the Enterprise a full supply of the vaccine. Just to kind of button the show up for us, because it's kind of been it's a train wreck of an episode, and it feels like it's kind of a train wreck to talk about.
Right.
What's your general feeling in terms of, if you had to pinpoint the one thing that you liked or disliked about this episode, what would it be? Is there anything that you do like about the episode?
Yeah, I think the sort of moral dilemma that Picard had to deal with of somewhat related to the Prime Directive, where, look, we have enough power, we could just go in and take what we want, but he didn't.
Yeah.
He had that, honor. He had that tendency toward diplomacy, or strong arming somebody, or using the weapons and so on. And then the other thing, I like that dynamic that he demonstrated, and that kind of tied closely in again with Tasha Yar's sense of honor in terms of electing to have the fight with Urina, and Troy actually supporting Tasha going against Picard. He didn't want Tasha to get into the fight because he thought that it would be fatal to her. But Troy weighed in and said, look, our mission is here to get the vaccine. And this might really be the best way to accomplish that mission. I thought that whole dynamic was interesting. And then the second point was how, um, since it was about the title of the show was Code of Honor, how Picard actually used some honor jujitsu on Lutan and turned honor back on him in the end.
Well, I think those are two really good points, and I agree with both of those. The two things. The first one, when it comes to Picard using his honor jiu-jitsu against Lutan, I think that might get back to our previous conversation in this recording about kind of the, you brought up the operational nature of honor, and I brought up kind of like the character trait of honor.
Mm-hmm.
I think both Picard and Lutan use honor in an operational way to meet their ends.
Mm-hmm.
I think the major difference between Lutan and Picard ultimately is that Picard looks at honor from a moral and ethical center, where Lutan looks at it from the perspective of how can I use this to take advantage.
Yes.
And I think the overall message of the show is that, honor might be a real thing and it might seem silly sometimes, but when good people use it, it produces good results. And when bad people use it, it produces bad results. And maybe honor isn't good or bad. It's always down to the individual.
Yes.
The one thing I do want to add that I like about this episode, this is the first episode where they really play up the friendship between Geordi and Data.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
I think this is the one where he walks in. I'm looking at my notes here. I just want to check because I made a note here about the actual scene itself. Here.
Oh, it was about the Italy diddly thing. Was that it?
Yeah, exactly. The Italy diddly.
Yes.
I think that is such a good scene between LeVar Burton and Brett Spiner.
It is, yes.
Because on one hand, it captures Data's kind of naivety when it comes to humor,
right?
But
exactly.
Also like his ability to kind of learn and kind of get it. But at the same time, it also sets Geordi up as kind of like this foil for Data to discover his humanity.
Right.
And I think there's one joke, and it's a terrible joke, but Riker tells it later, is that it's always Geordi and Data are trying to discover if Data can be creative by painting, if he can make like original works of art.
Right.
And Riker comes in and says, and it's a truly terrible joke. Like when I heard it today, I was kind of like, ooh, that wouldn't sound good today. Record your results, gentlemen. We're going to want to know what it looks like when a blind man teaches an android how to paint.
Right.
And they both kind of look at him like, fuck you, sir.
Yes.
But I think, this relationship between Data and Geordi has always been very special. And it starts here. And I think this joke between them and this conversation about humor is probably, for me, the best scene in the entire episode.
Yeah, it's very good. I agree. Yes.
So I think we can both agree on the obvious bad things about this episode. It's very clear that while it may not have been intended to be a racist episode, it clearly turned out to be. I think obviously it's a bad episode. It's just poorly put together and poorly written. It's not necessarily the actor's fault. I actually like the actor who plays Lutan a lot. I think he's actually a very good actor. It's just kind of sad that he had to be in this role.
Yes, he did a very good job. He really did. Yes. He did.
bef- I just want to make sure we credit this person correctly. Uh, Lutan was played. Lutan was played by Jesse Lawrence Ferguson. I think that actor did a great job in this episode in terms of portraying a villain with what he was given. I like his deviousness. I like his sense of cunning. I like this entire idea that he's pulling the wool over everyone's eyes, even though he doesn't. But other than that, this is just a bad episode. It's definitely the worst among the next generation, but I don't know, man. The finale to Enterprise is really bad too. I don't know. It's a hard toss up. But Dad, thank you for sitting down and discussing Code of Honor with me.
Sure, yeah.
So we end every show now by kind of having a general discussion about what's going on in the world, and I like doing that. So,
Right.
How do you feel about Biden's current executive actions?
I have not. The ones that I'm aware of was rescinding the Islamic travel ban,
Which is good.
I think that's good. I can't, I haven't paid enough attention as what are some of the others he's done
So
yesterday.
he rejoined us into the Paris Climate Accord,
Right.
which I think is great.
We're rejoining WHO.
Yeah, we're rejoining the World Health Organization, and Fauci's back on the team.
The WHO also put us back into COVAX, which looks at distribution of coronavirus vaccine on a global basis.
Oh, I did not know that.
Yeah.
Okay. So, one thing that, and you might be able to elucidate on this a little bit because you've worked in the biomedical field for such a long time. Do you think Biden is going to be able to get 100 million vaccinations out by the summer?
Well, the news this evening was that the distribution of vaccine is ramped up. So they're around the country, there's 1 million a day, and it's very uneven. For instance, to the south, down where your mother's from, they seem to be doing better there than they are in the Triangle, in Raleigh, Durham, Chapel Hill. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of local infrastructure and planning that has to be done. Mm-hmm. There was actually some thought that if we're really at 1 million doses a day being administered, then fine, then we'll be able to hit that 100 million target. At the same time, if we can go beyond that, we should. So there was something on the evening news where they were talking this Jen Psaki, I think that's how you say her name, the new press secretary, who is a absolute breath of fresh air.
Jen Psaki, yeah.
Yeah. That, why are we setting the goal too low? And she said, well, if we go beyond that, that's fine. And I think it's with all the problems we've had, it's kind of unreasonable to say, 100 million is too low. We're going to shoot for 200 million in the first 100 days. Let's just, give the government, and at all levels, from the federal down to the state, down to the local government, come up with a coordinated plan, which the Trump administration didn't support, so that we can get the vaccine supply, the manufacturing into the supply chain, into the distribution chain, right down to the clinics where it's going to be administered. And there's a lot of, IT, information management that has to take place too. I mean, one of the things is, you've got to, you have to give patients access to the vaccine, one of the approved vaccines. Then remember, you have to have them back in 21 days or 28 days, depending on the vaccine, so they get their second shot.
Right. Well, one thing that I know that the Biden administration is going to be trying to set up, and I think this plays somewhat into making the rollout of the vaccine effective. Um, so Margot's getting her second vaccination Monday.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think it's great that first line workers like her are getting um, vaccinated. But I
Yes.
think one place that we really need to start looking at are, unless there's a danger to them, I think we really need to vaccinate children in schools
Um,
because we're discovering through the data that we're collecting in terms of the spread of the virus that
right.
schools really are this kind of these super spreader sites for the coronavirus here
There
in
was
America.
there was one private high school in Raleigh today that has gone to online classes for the next 2 weeks because they've had an outbreak. And yeah, I would agree with that. I don't know. I'm not up to speed on how much data there is on safety of the virus for pediatric distribution, but I'm sure that's being worked on so that if the manufacturers can ramp up production so that that supply would be available, it really needs to be considered.
Well, one difficult thing that we have to deal with coming out of the Trump administration and going into the Biden administration, I think, when it comes to this vaccine, is we really have to determine where the super spreader events are, what their commonalities are, because the Trump administration took no information whatsoever to determine how the virus was spreading, how it was getting across state borders. You know, the Trump administration didn't do anything to catalog what was going on here, it turns out. I think one thing that we have to do is I think that we need to start having like real examination of where this virus spreads, not just in terms of super spreader events, but how it affects certain industries. For example, I don't know if you saw in the news today, but there's a restaurant association in California that is suing Governor Newsom because of the COVID restrictions on restaurants. Apparently, most of the scientific data is showing us that going and eating indoors or going and eating outdoors at a public space, if you position the tables correctly, there isn't a large chance of people being infected. Now, bar areas are a little bit different,
Mm-hmm.
but in terms of like general eating areas, the science is showing that like there's not a lot of spread of the virus versus places like concerts and schools and these large public gatherings. Um, one story that's coming out now is that there are hundreds of National Guardsmen, if not thousands now, who have contracted the virus.
Right.
Um, where did that happen? Like, were they in government buildings when they contracted this virus? Were they out in
Pretty
the
well
street?
known how under the sort of emergency conditions you know they didn't have any barracks for them, so they were actually in the Capitol building, and they were just all very tightly spaced, and in some cases they wore masks, in some cases they didn't, and so forth. And when you have that density of people, even in a somewhat large space as there are in the Capitol building, if you have a couple infected individuals, they're going to probably put enough virus out into the air that other people are going to breathe it in, or get it off a surface and rub it into their nose and so forth. And that's how it was transmitted.
Mm-hmm. Well, one thing that I read
Because
today.
it reflects why in Latino and African American communities the transition is so much higher, because of economic conditions. Many of those people live in multi-generational housing,
Mm-hmm.
so their living density is much tighter, so that when they're in their homes, they can't social distance and so forth. So you get one person come in who's infected, and particularly if they're asymptomatic, they're shedding virus and others are picking it up.
Well, one question that we have to ask in terms of dealing with this virus is really how are we going to take care of the poor? Because the poor are going to really be the hardest to vaccinate, monitor, and really follow in terms of how this virus proceeds and how we deal with it. I think that we really need to have a large systematic plan in place that deals with, families of lower income, lower economic power, lower economic status. I think that we have to have a really big mission in terms of like inoculating the poor first, because they're the ones that are often left out of the data. They're often the ones that are kind of not recorded or not reported. Like, and they're the ones that may actually prove the biggest risk. Like, for example, LA. I know you haven't been to LA in many, many years, but one of the reasons COVID is so bad in California is because the homelessness crisis in places like Los Angeles is just so overwhelmingly bad. And it's really causing a problem where, you have these large groups of people that don't live anywhere who are just gathered on the street for blocks and blocks and blocks, and 4 or 5 people living in tents and sleeping on the street and defecating in the street.
Well,
It's a public health crisis already,
I, I
and if
think
you
your
add a
comment,
virus to it,
I think your
it's deadly.
comment gets into again the supply and logistics that yes, those people in lower economic conditions, they need to have uh, fair access to the vaccine. It's important to try to keep them healthy or from getting seriously ill.
Mm-hmm.
It fits in with what Biden's trying to do with, I think, his two most important crises that he's addressing right now is the pandemic by getting people vaccinated and promoting mask use and social distancing, but also is the economic stim, uh,
Yeah.
stimulus package, particularly to help, families who are,
Dad,
go
the
ahead.
longer this stimulus takes, the more I think that we're day by day, the damage is getting worse in terms of the long-term economic, I guess, kind of window that America is going to be faced with. And it's closing more and more every day that we don't get people the necessary financial resources they need to just stay inside their houses.
Mm-hmm.
If we don't get them a real stimulus, $2,000 or even more, and maybe $2,000 over multiple months,
Mm-hmm.
I think the decision may be made for us one day where we're either going to have some sort of universal basic income, or people are going to be out rioting in the streets.
Mm-hmm.
This situation right now where people are losing their livelihoods and losing their homes and losing everything, you know, it was bad before the virus and it was happening before the virus, but the virus compounds this so much worse than ever before, to where the effects are not just, it's not just one family being evicted from their home. It's those children and their children's children living with the impacts of that going through generations. And I
Yes.
think that's what a lot of people are missing from this when we talk about large scale pandemics. When pandemics happen, the effects are generational. The effects of the Black Plague were generational.
Yes.
The effects of COVID will be generational. It and we have to really make a decision. And this gets back to what we were discussing when it came to Starfleet. What are the decisions we're going to make going forward? Are we going to value American life as human lives, or are we going to sit here and let some people fall by the wayside? Which, I think under the Trump administration, the answer was obvious. There were a lot of people that were going to fall by the wayside. I think Biden has a mandate now to go and rescue those people, but he also has to deal with the difficulty of kind of not only inoculating them, but also providing them a new economic foundation. Because a
Yes.
lot of these people aren't going back to work. They just
Right.
aren't.
Right.
So, like, what do you do with them? You can't just throw them out in the street. You don't want that. Like, there are conservatives who honestly believe out there, like, if you can't get a job and you can't work, you deserve to be in the street. But it's like, you don't want that, because those people who go out into the streets are desperate.
Right.
They're going to end up harming themselves. They're going to end up harming others. And it's, everything that can lead to the degradation of a society is present now if we're not careful. Like this, there are societies and kingdoms and rulers and reigns that were brought down because of pandemics and
Right.
their inability to handle them. We need to handle this. I understand why people are happy that Biden won and Trump is out, and I understand why people are celebrating this week because it does feel like a victory. But at the same time, I've kind of tempered myself this week knowing that like there's still this virus out there.
I
And
I
we
think
don't have it under control.
I think that yes, I think we can, celebrate and have some hope that things will get better because, Trump did not do the job he should have. We could talk all about, how he was totally for himself and so forth. But I agree with you is that, as Biden says, we're in a war against this virus.
Mm-hmm.
And everybody needs to take that attitude. And, if people are going to continue to be stupid and not wear a mask, God bless them is all I can say.
Well, there were two of the executive orders he signed. One was that masks are now required on all federal lands
Yes.
and property, which is great. But the second thing is he initiated the Defense Production Act.
Yes.
Which, if Trump had done that at the very beginning of this virus, I'd argue we'd be having a very different conversation.
It's one of a number of things that Trump could have done to make things differently.
Yeah, but that one in particular, that one really could have like changed the outlook of where we are now. It really could have.
Mm-hmm.
And when I say change the outlook, I think we're talking now about 400,000 lives lost.
408, last number I saw.
408. We're probably going to get to 500,000.
We will. By the end of February, I think we'll be at 500,000.
Do you think we're going to get to 1 million? Which was the 1% number that was thrown around a long time ago when this first started. That if we had 1% fatality of the population, it's going to be 1 million people.
1%. Let me do something real quick.
Yeah, we should probably do the math. And that's another thing.
If we're about 350 million, that's a little high. 1% is 3.5 million.
Yeah.
So, I think we could possibly, get to 1 million people. I would hope that by the fall, if the vaccines are effective and if the vaccines offer protection even against some of the newer strains that are expected, the UK strain is expected to become the predominant strain here by March.
Well, we also have to worry about the Brazilian strain. Apparently, the Brazilian strain is especially deadly in its own.
The South African, and I heard something on the NPR news. They interviewed Fauci, and he was saying that there's real concern now about the Brazilian and South African strains causing more severe illness.
Yeah.
In addition to being more transmissible.
I want to run by you something that Fauci said, and then we'll end the episode with this. He thinks that we can go back to large public gatherings or concerts or stuff like that by fall if we get vaccinated, if we get 100 million people vaccinated by the summer. He thinks if we get people vaccinated by the end of the summer, we'll be back to being able to have events by fall. I don't think that's going to happen personally.
What I heard him say is if the vaccines help us get to herd immunity, and that's also part of that is, didn't
he say like 85%?
Yeah, we've got to get up to 85% of people that have either had the vaccine or had COVID and survived it and have some circulating antibodies or have some T cells that can remember that they were exposed to the virus before and can, elicit an immune response if they get, re-exposed to the uh, uh, virus. That's where, I think that, when they talk about Biden's goal of 100 million inoculations in the first 100 days, yeah, let's do that. But if it ends up being 150 million, even better,
Yeah.
because I think it's better to have some achievable goal, which we've not had since it started. And then once we have achievable goal and people start to realize we really can do this if we all pull it together. And if the rates go down, because there's a feeling right now that the post Thanksgiving, Christmas, New Year surge is kind of peaking.
Mm-hmm.
We hope it goes down. But then the concern is if the more transmissible strain or strains show up, is that going to cause a new surge, which is again why it's important to get people inoculated with the vaccine as quickly as possible.
Yeah. I
And the other thing is, just as I decided this, I know that today the decision was made that the impeachment trial will not start till sometime in February. I'm actually okay with that.
Actually, they might start it Tuesday.
Well, I don't know. What I heard is that the impeachment papers, articles will go to the Senate on Monday. But I heard on the news that from Schumer even said this from talking to McConnell that they are not going to start the trial until February to give Biden the opportunity to get his cabinet in place. And
Which
I'm
would be
okay.
smart.
I'm okay with that because if Biden has his team in place so he can actually get things done to address these particularly the main crises issue of the controlling the pandemic and the economy, then, again, if you're fighting a war, you got to choose your battles.
Yeah. I think what is going to happen is that I think whether it's next week or it's February, I think he's going to be convicted. I really do. I think that Mitch McConnell is staring down the barrel of a gun now, and he has to make a choice. Is he going to shoot himself and be the guy that ran Donald Trump out of the Republican Party, which is going to nail him tons of backlash, especially from Trump supporters, which are still there. Just because QAnon goes away doesn't mean the Trump supporters aren't still there. I agree with you. I think it's a better battle to get your cabinet picks confirmed first. My biggest worry is that Republicans are going to somehow forestall this long enough we forget about it. Or they're going to work some sort of trickery to get Trump off. Because even McConnell has said, we need to give the president a fair hearing. It's like, okay, of course we need to give the former president a fair hearing, but we kind of know that the former president did some illegal things.
Well, I think that, we had talked about this, separately, that it's totally disingenuous from the Republicans to say, oh, Democrats, you don't want to pursue impeachment because it'll just make things more divisive. And it's like, bullshit on you. I mean, you all have been causing, divisiveness during the Trump administration by supporting him and not, putting any checks on him when he would take actions and say things that would just cause extreme division and so on. I just saw something on Washington Post. I probably won't be able to get the whole article tomorrow that said that Trump entertained a plan to install an attorney general who would help him pursue the election fraud claims.
Mm-hmm.
So he was not only, what Rosen was after Barr resigned, was a Rosen who became the acting attorney general. And the story goes is that Trump wanted to fire him and put a puppet in place who was going to try to, overturn the election in that way. So, if this can be documented, I mean, it's more evidence to me. I don't think it's, it's not related to the impeachment charges that are related to Trump fomenting um, in in insurrection, but it just demonstrates how heinous and criminal what Trump's attack on our democracy was and is still, and
And
he has to be held accountable for that.
and Republicans have to be the ones that hold him accountable.
Yes.
Like, it can't be us. They have to do it. Because
No,
otherwise they're supporting, if they don't hold him accountable, they become the party of sedition.
I sent an email to both North Carolina senators today, basically saying, and very professional and calm, saying that if if there's sufficient evidence to demonstrate that Donald Trump fomented and catalyzed the events in the Capitol on January 6th, I urge you to convict him as part of the impeachment hearings.
Yeah.
Furthermore, if there is firm evidence found that members of the House and Senate also fomented and catalyzed the events of 6 January, they should be prosecuted and removed from office. Lastly, I hope this is an opportunity for a reasonable Republican Party to emerge, because I believe that having a reasonable bipartisan discussion to solve our country's problems and advance us in a I don't think I use reasonable again, but in a reasonable manner is vital to our democracy. Now, I'm hoping that just because Jake Reckford said that to Tom Tillis and Richard Burr doesn't mean a hill of beans, but along with other people that may be writing them similar things. And I also acknowledge that I was a registered Democrat, but if there's enough Republicans from North Carolina that write their senators and say, don't let this guy off the hook, I'm hoping that will be part of the issue too.
Well, one of the big reports that are going out is that Mitch McConnell wants to convict him. Like,
that's the impression I get from what comes out, that he realizes that they have to distance themselves from what he did.
well, it's the only way they're ever going to get back the Senate or the House at this point.
Yeah.
Because, like, the GOP brand is so toxic and radioactive now that they've really left themselves very few options. One of the things that has to be done, though, if the GOP is really serious about fixing this issue, is that they have to stop doing so many things in bad faith. I think what January 6th and the entire Trump reign showed us is that, for a long time, we've been letting Republicans get away with bad faith arguments
Mm-hmm.
and just letting that happen. We can't do that anymore, especially
Right.
when it comes to this. Like, they especially if there's like Republicans in the House and the Senate that help foment January 6th.
Yes.
Like that, it simply can't be acceptable.
No.
I've gotten some flack recently for some posts I've made on Facebook where I've basically taken a real hard line against fascists. But those were the people that invaded the Capitol on January 6th. They were fascists. Like, if you really talk to them about their opinions about things, they're fascists. And I hold this opinion that you really can't negotiate with fascists. It's not in them. They're not built to negotiate on peaceful terms when their entire worldview is built on the idea that not only am I strong and powerful and worthy of individual power, but it is better for me to go out and fight and kill others and even die for that power. Like, that's baked into fascism.
Who was right in 1938, Chamberlain or Churchill?
But ultimately, Churchill.
Mm-hmm.
And that is something that I don't think a lot of people want to acknowledge, because it actually means taking a very hard, difficult moral and ethical stand against something that a lot of people haven't had to take a stand against in a long time.
Correct.
I've read the history of the Third Reich recently,
Mm-hmm.
and the threat that we're facing is still there, and if anything, it's more dangerous than before because it's been wounded.
Mm-hmm.
Hitler didn't become Hitler until he really lost that first election he tried for.
Mm-hmm.
Because before that, he was kind of seen as a buffoon.
Right.
It wasn't until he lost that election and saw, like, okay, I lost this one, but I have enough pull that he set himself up to become the dictator and the figurehead that he became. My worry is, I don't think Trump runs again in 2024.
Well, that
My worry is that they find a young, handsome fascist who's well spoken, well educated, and they put him at the front of the Republican ticket.
well, I think that's
Who
what
doesn't have any of those faux pas that Trump has.
I think that Hawley, the senator from Minnesota, saw himself, but
Yeah,
so right now, I mean, he's one that should be prosecuted and removed from office. But
absolutely.
based on your model of what Hitler did, Hawley could follow the same playbook that Adolf Schicklgruber did.
Mm-hmm. I, you know, I think the thing is, Hawley shot himself in the foot already. Like, I think that guy's political career, for the most part, is done. I really worry about. I think that there are some really interesting Republican voices out there that are good Republican voices, like Will Hurd from Texas. He's a former House member.
Mhm.
He's a former CIA operative,
Right.
worked in the intelligence field, but he's a good American who believes that he has a duty to serve all Americans. It'd be great if the Republicans went towards people like Will Hurd, but my worry is they're going to start going towards people like Eric Prince from Blackwater. They're going to start going towards Fox News personalities. They're going to start going. They're going to really double down on people from Newsmax and OAN. My worry is that really they're going to find kind of their champion, their shining
Well,
champion among
but
their ranks, and we're going to be fucked.
but that goes also to what we talked about before, is that they're actually, if you have more reasonable Republicans, which I would like to see a reasonable Republican Party,
Yeah.
versus, the fascists, the fascistas, like the Eric Princes and so forth. Like we talked about before, you really could see the Republican Party split in essence.
Well, Trump's even talked about starting a Patriot Party, but who knows what happens there if he gets
And, and,
convicted.
and, and that was one of the things I put in the email to the two North Carolina senators. I said, I didn't put it in a way that you need to either impeach him or make sure that he cannot run for any national elective office in the future. I said, but I did make the comment, didn't link impeachment to that, but I used it as a separate comment. I said, Donald Trump should be outlawed should be prevented from being able to run for any national elected office in the future.
Yeah.
Because if they don't impeach him, but there's some legal action, some law that Congress on a bipartisan basis can pass to say you're not going to be able to run for any national office again. If he wants to run for dog catcher in Palm Beach County, Florida, go ahead, whatever.
Well, I still maintain that Trump has so many legal hurdles ahead of him that in some ways the worry about him running again may be,
That could be the case, yes.
but just like New York had the Bund, we now have a, and I think they're a silent minority, but I think they're a dangerous minority nonetheless, of people that are easily convinced that their government is out to get them.
Look, the story about your grandmother. My mother had an aunt and uncle, since her maiden name was Schreiber, and they were, of course, very, very German. And she had an aunt and uncle that I think had immigrated from Germany and lived in Baltimore, and they were Bundist. And prior to Pearl Harbor, they had a picture of Hitler on their mantelpiece in their front room. And
Wow.
the story she told me is after Pearl Harbor, the picture of De Fuhrer went to the back room.
Interesting. Well, see, that there is worrisome, because I don't think that we want the worst thing that you can have happen right now is we let these fascists run off into the forest, and we don't find them and wipe them out. And I know people are going to hear that and go like, "Holy shit, Jay! Did you just say you should wipe out fascists?" I'm like,
Well, no, what you're saying
"Yeah,
is
like
what the
yeah,
government's been saying for a number of years now, that the biggest terrorist threat is from white nationalists in the United States.
absolutely." And it's like, but I, I think one thing that people aren't getting into their heads is that these people aren't negotiating.
No.
They're not sitting down at a table and saying like, "Here, we'll compromise on this point. We'll let go of our racism if you let us, bash the gay community." Like they're just not ever going to sit down and give you a good faith
No, there's no,
compromise.
as you said it before, their principles are such is there's no room for negotiation with these people.
And I think that is going to be such a hard hurdle for some Americans to get over, because I think one of the benefits of this country is that we believe that we can solve our problems without physical or violent conflict. We do it through debate, through discussion, and ultimately by creating new laws. Um, People don't understand that these fascists don't care about the law. They don't care about laws. They don't care about the rule of law. They only care about how they can use the law to their benefit. And if the law is against their benefit, they will happily break it.
Isn't that a description of the gentleman who, or the person who was just president for the last 4 years?
Yeah. The thing is, though, he's not a fascist. He's just a con man.
True.
Like, and I think that's the most dangerous thing that I keep going back to. Trump was a buffoon by all definition. Like, the fact that he got as far as he did was kind of miraculous.
Yes.
Scary, but miraculous for him. I am really worried about one day us running into a Donald Trump who is handsome, who is fit, who's young, who's intelligent, who can string words together, who has good arguments that don't come out of Mein Kampf. Like it, I'm
Well, it's kind of a Manchurian candidate story. Instead of them being a dupe of the Russians or the Chinese, they're a fascist dupe.
yeah. Well, even then, like, what if they're not dupes? You bring
Well,
up what, but
exactly.
you bring up the point that the biggest terrorist threat that America faces is from white nationalists. You know, I think a good number of them are idiots, but some of these people are actually very smart and knew what they were doing. One of the things that came out of the January 6th siege was that, one out of five members who took part in that siege were either veterans or active duty military.
Mhm,
Like, we need to be super concerned about this.
mhm.
Because if there's active duty military members in our military currently who are willing to stand up against their government and bring it down despite the oath that they took to serve and protect the Constitution, we're dealing with a massive problem. Like, it's a massive, dangerous situation that we just can't ignore. Like, it's one thing to have random Klan members walking into churches and synagogues and shooting 8 to 9 people. As awful as that is, it's different than having a highly trained soldier who's able to procure weapons and equipment going in and fighting a war that he thinks he's going to win against his government. It's a completely different threat.
Mhm.
Like, for every Dylan Roof, I'm worried that there is 5 like really smart terrorists out there who are planning to bring down the country someplace out in Oregon
Mhm.
that are just waiting for the day they get the shot. And after January 6th, like, we need to talk about security around the Capitol now.
Well, I read today that some of the National Guard troops are starting to come back, be sent home, but they may stay till March. Some
I
stay till March.
I think that we might have to post troops in DC for years,
Could
honestly,
be. Could
until
be.
we're sure that this is gone.
Right.
Well, on that note, everyone, thank you for joining us for Where No Bubs Has Gone Before. We will be back next time with an episode that Dad and I actually both enjoy a good bit, The Last Outpost, where we meet the Ferengi.
That's
So,
right.
Dad, thank you so much for joining me tonight for this episode. I'm glad we made it through this without too many mistakes. But thank you, and I'll see you again soon.
All right. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye, Dad.